Hello and welcome to English 325. I'll be your instructor, Dr. Sam Lackey, and I'm excited to get started. This is the week one lecture, so I'm going to provide some introductory material in this lecture, a little bit of review as we go back and maybe return to a few concepts that you've already learned in previous classes, but I do want to do that here at the beginning of the semester just so we're all kind of working with the same vocabulary and with the same basic knowledge. So this will kind of double as the introductory lecture and the week one lecture. But week one really is devoted to review. I want to sort of go back in time, talk about some old stuff in order to get us ready for the new material that we will be covering in this class. So English 325 is designed to be advanced literary study. So by this point, everybody in here should have taken some 200 level classes that were really getting you up to speed on literary analysis. I know some of you, many of you, in fact, because I have looked through the roster, many of you took my English 203 class at some previous point. Some of you have taken it pretty recently, like maybe last spring, maybe back in the summer. I saw that a few of you had taken some earlier 203 classes that I offered, and I think a couple of us probably took 203 or a similar class with somebody else. I know I haven't had all of you in 203 before, but I think I've had most of you in 203. So we've all done a lot of the same work previously, or at least we've all done similar things. So I'd like us to kind of get all on the same page here today, like I said, and just review some concepts that we've covered before, and that's where we'll start. And then we'll start moving into new things, really beginning in week two. So here today, I just want to talk a little bit generally about the class, give you guys an idea of what to expect. Again, many of you have taken me before, so that's helpful. You already sort of know the procedures and the type of schedule that I like to follow. But just to get started here in week one, if you're in Web Campus, go ahead and open up the week one module and just take a look at some of the things that I've already posted, starting with the syllabus. This is always kind of the typical first day or first week activity. Read through the syllabus. It's not a novel. You don't need to analyze the text, but there's a lot of important information there. So obviously course policies, basic info about me, my contact information if you need to email me, and I would like to hear from you over the course of the semester, but you can see my office hours, I have a phone number listed, and obviously my email. That will be the best way to contact me. This is, of course, an online class. We don't have meetings, but I'm always reachable and I'm always happy to talk, either through email exchanges, or if you need more extensive talking, if you have questions or concerns, or you want to maybe talk through an assignment, we can always schedule a video conference through Zoom. Just let me know. I'm always happy to set one of those up. And my schedule is pretty flexible. I teach live in Winnemucca. That's where I'm based. I teach live up there a couple of times a week. But the other days, typically Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, I work from home. So you guys can usually reach me and we can always talk. So just kind of look through the syllabus, take a look at the policies. You can also find a list of all of our assignments. You can find point values. You can see how much every assignment is worth. And you can also see the due dates for everything. So the most important part of the syllabus, and you might remember this if you did take 203 with me, the most important thing is to scroll down towards the end of the document, and you're going to find a detailed class schedule. And I always include those in my course syllabi because I want you guys to be able to see everything that we are doing over the course of the semester. Typically in Web Campus, I will only publish weekly modules 1 week at a time. So you might notice right now only the week one module is visible. And of course, at the beginning of next week, you'll be able to access the week 2 module, and that's typically the routine that we follow. But if you want to go ahead and look at the big picture, if you want to see everything that we're doing for the entire semester, if you want to see all the assignments, all the due dates, and also what we are doing on a week-to-week basis, all of that's available in the course schedule. So just take a look at that. You might want to save the overall document, save that syllabus, download it, keep it handy, if for nothing else, so you can consult that schedule and take a look at what's going on throughout the semester. That's especially useful if you miss time, if you're away from school for a week, or if you get sick or you have to go out of town, something happens and you've fallen a little bit behind. Use that syllabus, use that schedule to sort of catch up, or at least to have an idea of what you need to catch up on. And of course, if you have questions or if you need any extra help, you really should contact me. So if you have any questions about the syllabus, let me know, check out the schedule, and just keep that document handy. So like I said, let's do a little bit of review here in week 1, because I know I've taught English 203 in slightly different ways over the course of multiple semesters, and I know a couple of you have also taken 203 or similar classes with other instructors. So we've all had slightly different experiences at the 200 level, but I think we have enough commonality. There's enough common ground between what we've done for us to all kind of come together here in week 1. And like I said, I want us to kind of create a solid base or foundation from which to work over the course of the semester. So let's just go back and talk about a few things that we talked about in our 200 level lit classes. So as you guys know by now, we are analyzing literature, we are interpreting literature, providing our own original points and conclusions about the things that we've read. So we've done that before. I think by now we should have a pretty good grasp on what analysis is, how we do it, and why it's important. But I just wanted to kind of review a few of these concepts. So you guys should know, even going back as far as maybe like English 101, when we also talk about analysis, you should know by now that the process of analyzing anything, and we can analyze anything, but of course in this class we're analyzing literature, really the process of analysis can be best described as breaking something down to see how it works. And this is how I explain it to my 101 students as well. So we can analyze mechanical objects, physical things, but obviously we can also analyze literature, virtually any type of art. And the process, no matter what we are analyzing, the process usually stays the same. We break something down into its individual elements, into its individual components or parts. And that's how we're better able to understand how the thing works. So I always use the comparison of, like a car engine or some other kind of mechanical implement or device. If we wanted to see how that works, we take it apart. Right? We literally take it apart and we analyze each individual component. And they all work together, of course, but by understanding each individual part and its relationship with other parts, we're going to arrive at a better understanding of the overall car engine. And then we can sort of either literally or figuratively put it back together again with a greater understanding of how all the individual parts work and work together. So we can do that with a car engine, but we can also do that with a novel, a poem, a short story, or a play. And with those kinds of objects, those kinds of artistic creations, those kinds of texts, typically, we're analyzing not necessarily in that same kind of physical hands-on way, but the process remains the same. So with a novel or a short story, we're going to break it down into its individual elements. And those might not be actual mechanical parts like we would find in a car engine, but those works of literature still have individual components. They still have individual parts that all have roles and functions that are sort of separate and unique, but then all of those individual parts are also working together to create the whole. So we should be pretty familiar by now with our basic literary elements, because these are the parts, these are the components that we can often identify and sort of examine within any work of literature. So I know in 203, I talk a little bit about these. In other 200 level classes, you guys have worked with these, but really we've been working with these literary elements going all the way back to the 100 level, going all the way back to high school, in some cases going all the way back to middle school, because these elements get taught to us at a pretty young age, and then we tend to use them repeatedly throughout higher levels of school. So you guys know a lot of these, and you've worked with a lot of these by now. So if we're talking about fiction, of course, if we're talking about short stories or novels, we're often looking at things like characters. We're often looking at setting. We can often talk about theme, right? The larger message or meaning at work in the text. We can also take a look at, plot sequence. We can think about how the plot is arranged. Do we have flashbacks, flash forwards? Are we utilizing a chronological progression? We can look at all of those types of things. So one thing I know I did in 203, and a lot of you probably experienced at the 200 level, and you probably did it in 203 no matter who you took, was you sort of took a tour, a survey of the major types of literature, starting with fiction. We normally start with fiction because that's what most people are the most familiar with. So that means short stories, novels, in some cases ancient epics, which are often considered to be poems, but they have a lot of narrative elements that we would typically find in short stories or novels. So we typically start there, and then we move on to poetry, and we talk about certain poetic elements, which might be a little bit different than some of the elements that we often find in fiction. And then we typically move on and do drama, plays, stage plays. And that particular type of literature has some unique elements of its own. So that's one thing you should remember from the 200 level. Each type of literature has sort of different key components or elements that we can look for, but there is crossover. So a lot of the stuff that shows up in fiction will also show up in poetry, and in some form or another, it could also show up potentially in drama. So things like imagery and figurative language, those are elements that really we could explore in virtually any work of literature because they're present everywhere. But as I talk about in 203, stuff like poetic language often really puts a closer emphasis on imagery and figures of speech, metaphors, similes, personification. We find a lot of that stuff in poetry. So often when we're breaking poetry down, analyzing an individual poem, we're going to be finding those aspects of poetic language. Now, those same elements can also be found in fiction. You can certainly find imagery and figurative language in novels and short stories. So sometimes you can look for the same stuff in fiction and poetry, but then there are going to be some things that are kind of unique to poetry. And I talk about these as kind of sound elements. These are things that really dictate the sound and rhythm of a poem. Stuff like rhyme scheme, stuff like meter, and other aspects of poetic form. And we're going to notice that those types of things are pretty unique to poetry. We're not going to find a lot of meter or rhyme scheme in a short story. We're not going to find stanzas and other aspects of poetic form in a novel. So those are kind of specific to poetry. Not all poetry has rhyme scheme or meter, but a lot does. And at least some of the older poetry that we're going to read in this class will have those things. whereas short stories and novels typically don't. In a similar way, a lot of poetry isn't necessarily narrative. A lot of short poems are considered to be lyric poems, which means that they don't always necessarily feature a clearly recognizable narrative. Now, some poems are very much narratives, and they tell stories with characters and plots and clear settings, and that's great. In some ways, they can resemble short stories or novels in that way. But short stories and novels are almost always going to have clear narratives. So we can do more with plot, we can do more with characters, we can do more with specific narrative events, typically in short stories and novels. So those are often considered to be more fiction-based elements. Not to say that they don't show up in poems, but they show up in poems maybe a little bit less often. So we should be able to navigate these different elements. So we should already sort of recognize and appreciate that some of these elements are often found in fiction, others are more commonly found in poetry, and even drama has some unique elements of its own, things that are going to be unique to stage plays. But at the same time, they share things with fiction and poetry. So you might want to go back and sort of refresh your memory about these three major types of literature: fiction, poetry, and drama. Again, you've learned about them before, but we're revisiting all three in this class. We're not going to go back through and talk about each type of literature generally and offer a history. I don't feel the need to do that in here because I think you guys have already done that. But just remember, we're going to be covering these different types, these different styles, so we are going to be finding different elements to examine. So throughout the semester, we'll be reading short stories, we'll be reading some poems. At least for 1 week, we'll check out a play, and then towards the end of the semester, we're going to read a novel. So that is one thing you might notice. At this level, the reading load is going to be a little bit heavier than what we saw at the 200 level, but I still think it's manageable, and we're going to rely on our textbook, the one required book for the class. We're going to rely on that as our reader. It's going to give us all the things that we are reading throughout the semester, so you'll have access to all of our literary texts. That's really what the book does for us. Many of you might have used this same book in 203. I know I've used it before in 203. I think Dr. Cooley uses it in his 203 if you've taken him. But one thing to notice is we're not really using the textbook for any of the instructional chapters. I'm hoping you guys have already read a lot of those. We're really just using the book as a reader. We are just using it for its selection of literature. That's where it comes in handy for us. But just be sure that you have the book. It's called Literature, a portable anthology. Make sure you have the proper edition. Again, this information can be found on the syllabus, or you can just go to the GBC bookstore and search for this class. I've ordered it through the bookstore, so you can buy it there. You can also just get it on your own. You can order it online without involving the GBC bookstore, but just make sure you have the book. If you don't already have it as you're watching this lecture, make sure you have it by the end of week 1 so you can complete our reading assignment and get up to speed. You can get an ebook version. There's electronic versions of the book. You can get a used copy. I really don't care. Just make sure you have one soon. And that's the only required material for the class. But obviously you guys need to hop online and check out the weekly modules at the beginning of each week. And you already know that, but I do like to establish a consistent routine and schedule in all my classes. So those of you who have taken me, you know at the beginning of each week, I'll publish that week's module, and everything that you need for the week will be there. You'll have everything available. That week's lecture will be posted Monday morning. The reading assignment for the week will be posted. Whatever assignment is due that week will be posted. And of course, I'll always have announcements, and anything else that you need should be available and easily accessible. So if you ever hop on to check out that week's module on a Monday morning or a Monday afternoon or even a Tuesday morning and you don't see something, if there appears to be something missing from the module, just shoot me an email and I'll address it. But normally everything you need should be there first thing Monday morning. And whatever assignment is due that week, it's going to be due by the end of the week. That means 11:59 p.m. Sunday night. That's when the week ends, and then first thing the following day, Monday, that's when the next week begins. So you guys already know that, but that will stay the same throughout the semester. And as far as kind of what we need to do each week, in addition to watching these lectures, which I would very much like you to do, also keep in mind that we do have a discussion board. So each week we'll have a discussion post that we need to do, and these will be about the assigned reading. So I'll usually have some specific questions about whatever we are reading that week. It might be a couple of short stories, it might be a collection, a handful of poems, could be a play. Later on, it's going to be a novel that we spend a few weeks reading. But whatever it is we are reading, I want you to talk about it that week in the discussion board. So I'll always pose a few questions, but the discussion board's really meant to be a sort of informal, safe space to talk and share ideas. It's really a way for us to simulate an in-class discussion. So what we would normally do in an old-fashioned traditional literature class is we would sit around and talk. We would talk about the stuff that we read. We would share our opinions. We might have some friendly debates, and that's what I want us to do on the discussion board. So you can always respond to my specific questions, but you can also kind of riff on your own if you have particular areas of interest. If there's something you want to talk about in relation to that week's reading that I'm not really addressing in my questions, you can just kind of go off on your own tangent. You can sort of do your own thing, but I have put in some sort of guidelines and just sort of basic parameters. If you look at the instructions for the week 1 discussion board, I'm just sort of telling you a few things that I want you to keep in mind for all future discussions as well. Try to write a paragraph or two. Whatever it is you're telling us, be somewhat complete and thorough. If you're addressing one of my questions, try to really answer the question. Or if you have a thread or a pursuit of your own that you want to share with us, try to finish the job. Again, these can be relatively informal. I'm not going to grade your discussion posts the same way I would grade an essay. I'll be a lot more lenient. I'm not going to look, and count off for minor mistakes, but I do want to see complete thoughts. I want to see complete ideas, as opposed to just a random observation. I want you guys to put a little bit of thought and time into these. But another thing that I would like you guys to do on a weekly basis, and this can sort of be step 1, and the discussion board can be step 2 of a larger process. But what I want you to do as you're reading each week's assignment, I'd like you to keep a reading journal. So some of you may have done this before. If you took Dr. Cooley, I know he made you have one at the 200 level, but I think it's really important in this class as well. So I talk about this a little bit in the syllabus. And I want to make this clear because for me, the reading journal is not something to grade. It's not something that I want to necessarily evaluate you on. It's something that I want each and every one of you to do individually. And really, I think an old-fashioned, typical, I don't have one in front of me right now, but an old-fashioned notebook might be the best way to do this, but you can also keep your reading journal electronically. You can just make it a Word doc or a Google Doc or whatever. I don't care the format, but I just want you guys to be able to record your impressions, your thoughts, and your ideas about each thing that we read. This is just a good way to create a written record, and it really will help you later on. So as you're reading the short stories or the poetry for that week, just write a little journal entry. It can be relatively brief. It can be informal. Again, it's really just for you. I don't anticipate you sharing your journal with many other people. I mean, you can if you want, but I'm probably never going to see it unless you bring it to me or email it to me. Unless you want me to see it, there really won't be a reason for me to look through your entries, and I'm never going to assign grades to the journal. But this is just a way for you to get your thoughts down on paper so you don't forget. You got to keep in mind, we are reading a lot this semester, just one novel. Everything else is pretty short, but every week we have stuff to read over the course of at least, I don't know, I think we kind of stop reading after week 11 because then we're just focusing on our final paper. But even if you're just looking at the first 11 weeks, that's 11 different reading assignments. That's a lot of text. That's a lot of material. A lot of it's going to be quite different from what came before or what comes after. So it's hard to remember all of that. And I really think it's necessary for you guys to create a written record so you can go back, remember, but also the reading journal will help you to get ready for the discussion board. I want you to view this as kind of a multi-step process. So step 1, read the text that is assigned for that week. Step 2, create a journal entry, either as you're reading or right after you finish reading. At the very least, once you finish, you should add a little bit if you've already started the entry. Sort of wrap it up with a conclusion once you've finished reading the assigned text. And then the next step is to actually write your discussion post. So I want you guys to kind of recognize the difference between each step. The journal entries will often be what we call sort of emotional responses. You may have heard this before. Part of literary analysis is making the transition from your initial emotional response to a text to then later creating a more polished analytical response. This is a really important concept to grasp, and I'm going to sort of talk about it repeatedly throughout the semester. We always start with an emotional response to whatever it is we read. And that's fine. I don't want you guys to think that that's a bad thing. It's not. It's normal. It's natural. We often start by sort of evaluating what we've read. You know, do I like it? Do I think it's good? Did it move me? Did it interest me? Did it make sense to me? Did it speak to me and deliver a message or a meaning that I find important or useful in some way? Or, profound in some way. So we can just start by answering those basic questions. Did I like it? Do I think it's good? How did it make me feel? Right? Those are all parts of our initial, immediate, emotional reaction. And there's often going to be some good nuggets there. Just as you're sort of recording your feelings and your initial responses, there's going to be some good observations usually sort of embedded in all of that. There's going to be some ideas. There's going to be some real world connections. There's going to be some good work that you're already starting to engage in. But by getting that emotional response written down, you have a record, okay? You can go back and revisit it. But then as you make the transition to the discussion board, again, some of that emotional stuff can stay in there. But part of what the discussion board is helping us to do is to take that first step away from just an emotional response towards something that resembles analysis, right? We don't have to forget how we felt. We don't have to forget our own personal evaluations or opinions about the text. And of course, almost all analysis is going to be opinion-based. But as you make the move towards analysis, you're going to start getting more systematic. You're going to start getting more specific. You're going to start pushing further beyond just how it made me feel and more towards what it all means. Why is the author doing it? What is it designed for? What's the purpose? What's the point? And what's the larger significance, or what's the larger effect created by whatever it is that we're discussing, whatever elements it is that we are talking about. So that's kind of the move that we make. We start with emotion, and then we start getting more analytical by zeroing in on specific literary elements, by figuring out what they do, how they work together, and how they create a larger whole. One thing that I talk about a little bit in 203, and I'll talk about it in here too, is we need to think about literature and individual works of literature as being active things. They're not passive objects that we simply admire and look at. They are active things. Works of literature do work in the world. They make things happen. Different things. They can have different social effects. They can have different emotional effects, but they're always designed to do something, to make people think a certain way, feel a certain way. In some cases, they're designed to make people do things or not do things. Even if it's all kind of mental, if everything that's happening is taking place inside people's heads, that's still active. Right? The literature is still actively doing things, or at least it's designed to. So we have to get to the bottom of what the literature is supposed to do. What are the intended effects? What is the meaning? What is the message? And what is the larger significance? Who cares? Why does it matter? Why does it matter to us or to any reader? So those are some of the questions we eventually need to grapple with. So as we kind of make that move from the emotional response to a more analytical response, we're going to get a little bit sharper, more detailed, more specific. We're going to work more closely with literary elements, and we're going to start incorporating some specific strategies. And that's a big focus of this class. So we'll talk about that here in a moment. But let me just finish with kind of our weekly routine. So I would like you to do an entry in your reading journal each week about whatever it is we are reading that week. And then by the end of the week, you can do your discussion post. All right? You'll always have until Sunday night to get those posted. Also, we will have some other assignments over the course of the semester. So the reading journal and the discussion board, those are weekly things. So just get into the habit of doing those every week. We also have 3 short essay assignments. I've called these short analytical responses, SARs for short. And we have 3 of them. So they'll be kind of dispersed over the course of the semester, and each one will give you a chance to practice some specific skills and concepts that we've been working on in class. So the first SAR, for example, is due, I believe, at the end of week 4. And by that point, we've covered several different strategies for analysis. And we'll talk about some of them briefly here. But that first SAR just gives you a chance to practice some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about beginning next week and then through week 3 and week 4. So that's the first SAR. The second SAR is due at the end of week 6, and that is simply a close reading assignment. If you've never done a close reading before, don't worry. We're going to spend multiple weeks talking about it, and if you have done it before, great. It's time to do it again, because close reading is a very important part of literary analysis. So the second SAR gives us a chance to practice that particular skill. And then the third SAR is going to give us a chance to really adopt a specific critical lens or a sort of critical / theoretical perspective. And that's another thing we're going to be doing in this class, talking about different critical and theoretical approaches to the study of literature. So that final SAR is due later in the semester after we've covered a bunch of different schools of literary criticism and theory. And we're going to start applying some of those theories to the works that we read. So you have those 3 short essays, and I want you to think of them as short essays. They are much more formal, and they should be much more polished than what you do in your reading journal or the discussion board. So understand that I have different expectations for different assignments. The discussion boards, again, they can be conversational, kind of fun. Imagine that we're all sort of talking to each other, having a conversation, having a debate, perhaps. Whereas the essays need to have a more polished, a more academic tone. Okay, they're really not conversational. They are not simulating a class discussion. They are formal examples of analysis. So you need to adopt the proper tone. You need to write more. Obviously, the length will be more extensive. So I have all the instructions and details about the SARs. You can read through those, at least for the first two. I'm not sure if I finished the instructions for the final one yet, but that will be done soon. You can see that I want about 3 or 4 pages for each one of those short analytical responses. So we'll do those throughout the course of the semester, and then at the end of the semester, we have our final paper. That's our seminar paper, our big essay, somewhere in the range of 7 to 10 pages. You will choose any text that we've read over the course of the semester. In fact, I'll probably open it up even more and let you guys choose any text that you can find in the book, because you have about, I think, 40 short stories to choose from, like 200 poems and 5 or 6 plays. So I'll probably let you guys choose anything you want. You can also choose the novel that we are reading, Cannery Row by John Steinbeck. So I misspoke earlier when I said portable. Our portable anthology is the only required book. I'm sorry, I forgot about Cannery Row. So if you haven't purchased that yet, you still have some time. We're actually not starting the novel until week 9. So that's in the second half of the semester. So if you don't have it yet, don't panic, but you want to go ahead and get it soon. Again, this novel is easily accessible. I've ordered it through the GBC bookstore, so you can get it there. You can also just order it on your own. There's used copies, new copies, whatever you want to do. Just buy it, because we are reading it later in the semester. So I'm sorry, you have 2 required books, our textbook and the novel that we're reading at the end. Okay, so for that final paper, you can choose anything in the books and write about it. And of course, we'll have a lot more time to discuss that assignment and the parameters. But we don't have exams in here. Really, it is a writing-based class. Everything comes down to the final paper, the 3 short essays, the discussion board, and just our ability to participate and keep up with the reading. Again, the reading journal is important, but it's not graded. And the only other assignment is a proposal and critical summary that you'll submit before the final paper. So we'll talk about that stuff later. So just let me know if you have any questions, but I want you guys to get into that weekly routine, because we're pretty much maintaining it throughout the semester. So just watch my lectures, keep up with the discussion board, and make sure you're keeping up with all of the bigger assignments as well. Okay, so before we sign off, let's just go back through a few things that you might remember from your 200 level lit classes, and I'll give you a little bit of a preview of what's to come in this class. So I've already talked about the literary elements. Just make sure you have a good handle on them, and I'm happy to post some of this review material. I have a bunch of old handouts and documents from my 203 classes. So I would typically post, the elements of fiction, the elements of poetry, the elements of drama. I would post all of those for my 203 students. I'm happy to post those for you guys. In fact, I'll probably just go ahead and do that here in week 1. So you guys have all of that material just in case you've forgotten, or maybe you didn't save any of that stuff from your 203 experience. But just be familiar with the elements. Those are the parts and the components that we're often going to be working with when we analyze. But one of the big moves that we're going to make here as we transition to the 300 level is we're going to start doing more with the elements. It's always great to identify key elements at work. Here's some really interesting imagery. Here's a character that's very strange and I want to learn more about him. Here's an important part of the theme. Here's an important message, or here's a really important piece of symbolism or a metaphor that really matters. It runs throughout the text. It's always great to identify those types of things, and then you can start doing stuff with them. But often at the 100 level or the 200 level, we'll have students doing good observational work, finding good elements. Oh, that's cool. Oh, that's interesting. But often we don't get beyond the observational level in those lower level classes. We just kind of conclude by saying that's weird, or that's interesting, or I like that, or I think that's really a powerful device or a powerful element at work. Now we have to start doing more with our observations. We have to start arriving at original interpretations, original conclusions. What does that metaphor mean? Why is it important? Why is the author using it? What does this character represent? Why is it important? Why is the author using it? We have to answer some of those bigger picture questions. And to help us do that, we're going to be learning several specific strategies for analysis. And some of this stuff is going to sound familiar. You did some of this stuff in your 203 classes, but we're going to be a lot more thorough. We're going to be a lot more intentional about these strategies here in 325. So I'll just run through some of the stuff that we're going to start covering next week when we begin talking about these strategies in depth. So we're going to talk about surface versus depth. That's one strategy. We're going to talk about patterns, opposites, different kinds of contexts, cultural context, historical context. We're going to talk about different genres. We're going to talk about social relevance, all the different critical or theoretical lenses or perspectives that we can adopt. We're going to talk about joining a larger critical conversation. And we're also going to try to master the part to whole method. Moving from part to whole is really what analysis is all about. So we'll be discussing that over the next couple of weeks as well. So again, you might have heard many of those terms before. Maybe you've worked with a few of them or adopted a few of them before, but I want us to get comfortable with all of those different strategies. I want us to practice them, and I want us to start using them in our formal work. And I'll also include just some basic questions about some different literary elements that you guys can always ask yourselves. And these are things you can write about, in your reading journal. These are things you can address on the discussion board as well. But these are just questions designed to spark analysis. So I have some questions about character and characterization, questions about setting, also point of view or perspective. It's really important to think about narrators and speakers. Who's talking? Who's telling us the story? Is it a character in the story? Is it the protagonist? Do we get a first person narrative perspective, or do we have an omniscient narrator or some other third person narrator delivering the story to us? And the piece that we're reading this week, The Thing Around Your Neck, we're going to actually see second person point of view, a second person narrative perspective. And that's a little bit strange. We see that when we see you did this, you did that, versus I did this, or he did that. So what does that second person perspective do? What kind of effect does that create? You guys can reflect on that as you're reading our first assignment this week, our first reading assignment. So you can always think about perspective, point of view. That matters a lot with any kind of narrative. And again, this is usually associated with fiction, short stories and novels, but we can also think about speakers in poems. Because poems will have speakers. We usually use the term speaker for a poem as opposed to narrator in a work of fiction. But the role is similar. especially if the poem is telling a story. So what about the speaker? Is it a reliable speaker? What kind of perspective is the speaker offering, and what kind of effect does that have on readers? Also, there's always comparisons that you can make with any kind of work of literature. What can you compare the text to? You can compare it to other texts, and not just necessarily works of literature. You can compare it to a TV show or a movie or a graphic novel. Those are other types of texts, and they have a lot in common with traditional literature, as we talked about in 203. If you took me for 203, you might remember the alternative media assignments that we did, where we would sort of find literary features in movies and TV shows and other types of art, other types of, mediums. So we can always do that. We can always compare a text to other texts, other short stories, other novels, other poems, or maybe even TV, movies, or visual art. But we can also compare what we are reading to real life situations. We can use our own experiences. Again, that's a good thing to do with that initial emotional response that you're recording in your reading journal. What does this text remind me of? Oh, yeah, this makes me think about this one time in high school when this thing happened to me, or this one time I saw or witnessed something that kind of resembles what's happening here in the story. That's a fine thing to do. That's not all we want to do. There is a limit to that. There's a limit to relating things to your own life, but it's a good place to start. It's a good way to jumpstart analysis. It's not an end point, but it can be a good starting point. Okay, so there's always good comparative work that we can do. We can think about irony. There's going to be a lot of irony at work in various literary texts. That's when the expected outcome is the opposite of the actual outcome. What effect does irony have in a poem or a short story? We can find verbal irony. We can find situational irony. We'll talk more about that. But that's another thing to look for, talk about, and analyze. Think about time sequence, especially with fiction, right? How does the plot unfold? Again, are we following a chronological sequence, or do we jump back and forth in time? Do we jump forward and backward with flash forwards and flashbacks? Do we see shifting verb tenses? What effects does any of that potentially have? We can also think about word choice. We can get really granular, and sometimes we need to. Once we start close reading, once we're working with poems, we really need to look at individual specific words. Think about the difference between denotations and connotations. Think about imagery. Think about specific verbs, specific adjectives, specific adverbs. We can find examples of figurative language, as I've already mentioned, metaphors, similes, personification, hyperbole. All of that's going to be on display. We can also start looking for patterns. Are certain words repeated? Are certain phrases repeated? Are certain structures on display multiple times? If we see repetition, if we see other patterns, that's probably important. That's something to note, something to analyze. And also, a sort of more specific poetic element, like I was saying earlier, involves sound. We're talking rhyme scheme, we're talking rhythm, we're talking meter. And we typically only find that stuff in poetry, sometimes in drama, older drama, not as much in fiction, although there can be exceptions. So when we're reading poetry, we really want to focus on sound, rhyme, rhythm, meter. Think about how stanzas are arranged. Read this stuff out loud. Read a poem out loud and figure out what it sounds like and what larger effects those sounds might have. So we'll be going through all of that stuff throughout the semester. And also, just to kind of wrap up our review, it's important to know that there's different ways to write about literature. There's different kinds of common writing assignments that you'll encounter in a literature class. And I'm kind of expecting you guys to already be familiar with some of these basic types of writing assignments. So by now, over the course of our educational careers, we should be pretty comfortable with summary. We should be comfortable with summary. All right, we know how to summarize texts. You're not going to have a lot of formal summary assignments in here. In fact, we don't have any. In 203, I make people summarize a little bit, but in here, I just want that to be something that you guys do sort of on your own, in your notes. There can be a little bit of summary in your reading journal. There can maybe be a little bit in your discussion posts, and there can be a little bit in your more formal essays as well. But what you have to realize about summary at this level is that it's always a means to an end. We're not going to summarize just for the sake of summarizing. Okay, we summarize in order to accomplish a larger goal. So within a big paper, you might spend a few sentences providing a brief summary of a chapter or a scene or an especially important moment in the narrative that you are examining. But you're only going to do that to set up your original analysis. You're only going to summarize so you can set the stage for the more valuable material that's to come later. Okay, so just keep that in mind. We only summarize to kind of get our reader oriented or to explain a few important things before we launch into our original analysis. So if you summarize too much, or if you summarize and then never follow it up with any original analysis, you really are missing the mark. So we don't have any summary assignments in here, but it is something that you'll need to do periodically. Just to kind of recap important stuff, remind us of important events, get us oriented, get us situated, and then hit us with your analysis. So we want to keep summary somewhat limited in our actual, submitted work. But if you're reading something complex, something difficult, writing a summary of your own in your reading journal or in just your notes, that's a very useful thing. I don't need to see it. I don't need to evaluate it, but by summarizing it, you're just helping yourself. You're creating another part of that written record that you'll be able to refer to and use later on. Okay. Also, a response is another type of writing that we commonly do in a lit class. That's really what the journal and the discussion board is all about. Those are the places where we respond. And like I've been saying, responses are often personal, they're often emotional, and they're often a little bit rough around the edges. They're not quite polished. They're not always fully thought out. They can often be a little bit casual and conversational, and that's okay. But just remember, that's not where we end up. That's where we start. Summarizing and responding, those are early steps. Okay, and we have to eventually move beyond them, but they are helpful and necessary things to do early on in the process. There's also something called explication. We also call this close reading. And this is an assignment that requires you to pay special attention to the language of a text. Okay, so we're still looking at literary elements, but we're really zeroing in on specifically verbal things. We're looking at words. We're looking at phrases. We might even be looking at grammar and mechanics, but we're looking closely at what language does, the effects that language has. So we're very interested in style, imagery, figurative language, word choice, and maybe even grammar, punctuation, and other things like that. We're going to be doing close reading later in the semester, and then by the end, when we're putting together our big papers, close reading will be a part of that. It'll be one of the things that we're doing in those major essays at the end. And then finally, analysis. Obviously, analysis is our focus in this class, but it's a process. We work our way up to analysis. We can do a little summary, we respond, we look at language, we identify elements, and then we analyze. All right, so I think that's pretty much all we need to do here in week one. I want to give you guys some time to sort of get acclimated, to get organized. So check out everything I've posted here in week one. Take a look at the syllabus. You can take a look at our first discussion board, and we only have one reading assignment. I want to kind of start you guys off relatively slowly. Let's get up to speed. I know week one's always a little bit hectic, but by week two, we're going to be on our normal schedule. So we start talking about some of these strategies for analysis, and we have more reading to do in week two. So make sure you have everything that you need. Let me know if you have questions or concerns about anything I've talked about here today, or if anything on the syllabus isn't making sense. If you have issues with the books, get in touch with me. Let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next week.